I am the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada, reaching you today from unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territories in what is also known as Ottawa. Welcome to this conversation that we are very fortunate to be having today with Nigel Topping. Before I introduce Nigel and let you know what the format of our conversation will be today, a few logistics. So you will notice that there is a little translation button or interpretation button at the bottom of your screen to the right side on the Zoom whatever, just on your little Zoom bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We will be speaking in French in part today, so make sure to choose your preferred language in that interpretation button. We will be receiving some questions from folks who have already prepared questions for Nigel. And we also want to make sure that you all have the opportunity to ask your questions. We ask that you put your questions in writing in the Q&A function, which you can also find on the utility bar at the bottom of your Zoom screen, or in the chat box. I can see that a few folks have already started introducing themselves in the chat, and I would really love if everyone who's with us today could do the same. Let us know who you are, where you're calling in from, and what organization you're affiliated with, if any. And with all of those logistical announcements out of the way, let me say hello to Nigel Topping, UK high-level climate action champion. Hi, Nigel. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hi, Catherine. Great to see you. Great to be with you.
So as you know, this webinar is taking place less than 6 months before the long-awaited COP26, and I'm sure the UK presidency is feeling very excited to have this never-ending COP preparatory period over with. As the only network in the country that brings labor, development, faith-based, and Indigenous groups together with key national, provincial, and territorial environmental organizations in Canada, we here at Climate Action Network Canada really know how important it is to be bringing the role of non-state actors into the climate community space, and in particular into the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change space in order to drive ambitious climate outcomes. We are consistently bringing some of the most diverse delegations to the conferences of parties to the UNFCCC, and I think we're really privileged to have Nigel with us today to give us your perspective on how to ensure this coming COP is like no other in actually creating space for civil society to really contribute in meaningful and transformational ways to land a good outcome by the end of the year. So how we're going to have our conversation is I'm going to set up a couple of questions, and then we're going to invite some of our members and allies who are particularly keen to engage with you to ask some questions of their own. You'll have a chance to respond to some of those prepared questions, and then we'll open it up for some general questions. Sound good?
Yeah.
All right. So, for the first session, so, here we are, we're in, of course, unprecedented times. COP26 is going to be a test, not just to see if we can collectively come together to discuss climate change and approaches to solving this crisis, but whether we can figure out how to come together to tackle multiple crises that we are all facing together at the same time. I'm really struck by this quote from a speech that COP26 President Alex Sharma offered last week, where he said, "I asked my daughters what message I should give to world leaders about their priorities, and my daughter's response was simple: please tell them to pick the planet." And I love that sentiment, and I think for me, I would ask people to pick the planet and to pick people, right? Because if anything, we've learned this year how inextricable our own health and well-being is from the health and well-being of the natural world. So given that, how can civil society help to build trust, to keep up the level of ambition that's needed, and to keep that alive both inside and outside negotiations, but most importantly with the people and communities that we work with and represent? So on that note, I'm going to first welcome Katarina from the Collectif de la Société Civile du Québec à la COP26 to ask a question about civil society participation at COP26. Katarina, come on in.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you well.
Est-ce que je vais, si c'est d'accord, je vais poser ma question en français.
Oui, Catherine, si tu vas le poser en français, je me débrouille, mais s'il te plaît, assez lentement.
D'accord. Depuis 2008, les YMCA du Québec, d'abord, pardon, je me présente. Mon nom est Caterina Milani. I will present myself in English. I am coordinating the international initiatives for the YMCAs of Quebec. And since 2008, the YMCAs of Quebec organized a civil society collective to participate to international events where the civil society is mobilized. In that context, en février 2020, un collectif de la société civile québécoise a été mis sur pied dans le but de sensibiliser, former, mobiliser et engager les acteurs de la société civile québécoise de façon intersectorielle et intergénérationnelle en vue de la COP26. Via une série de webinaires et d'actions, le collectif de la société civile souhaite mobiliser et engager la société civile afin qu'elle puisse participer de façon active et éclairée à la COP26. Ma question porte donc sur l'accès à la COP26 dans un contexte de COVID-19, bien sûr. On entend que la COP26 prendra une forme différente, étant donné la pandémie. Et comme collectif, c'est ce à quoi on essaie de s'adapter et de se préparer. Dans ce contexte, comment est-ce que la présidence compte assurer de créer un espace civique qui va permettre la participation pleine et entière de la société civile, dont le rôle est pour nous crucial pour le dialogue social et la hausse de l'ambition climatique? Comment les instances étatiques vont s'assurer d'être à l'écoute de la société civile et d'offrir un accès équitable aux négociations? Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. First of all, I love the fact that you've pulled together this coalition that's intersectoral and intergenerational. I think one of my real hopes for Glasgow is that we really do see a sense of solidarity. And I think that's across sectors, across geographies, and across generations. Maybe I should just quickly, Catherine, explain a little bit my role. So the role I have of high-level climate action champion was created in Paris by the parties in recognition of the reality that national governments alone cannot solve the climate crisis. So my role is, I'm appointed by the UK government, but I don't represent the UK government. I represent a mandate which is created by the parties to work with non-state actors. So particularly those who have the political power to make difference, so businesses, private sector, cities, states and regions, but more broadly with civil society as well, of course, may not have the economic or the rule-making power, but have the moral power, the power of numbers often, and the clarity of what needs to happen. Couple of thoughts about the challenges, and of course I work closely with the UK presidency, but I'm not formally part of them. First thing to say is that the UK presidency is I know very committed to this being a physical COP, and many of you will know that is very important for the most vulnerable countries, so the small island states and the least developed countries, for whom the UNFCCC is one of the few arenas where they have real political agency because it's a consensus process. They've been very clear that they do not want a virtual COP because they feel that they will be disenfranchised. And so the UK government's, Alok, you mentioned that quote from his daughters, picking the planet, and I think he would agree with you, pick the planet and the people. It's very clear that we're going to have a physical COP. So the intention is to have a relatively normal COP in terms of the physical organization. And so civil society being represented through the normal mechanisms that those of you who've been to a COP, through the formal observer groups recognizing the UNFCCC process. And then of course, all of the accredited organizations who form up a very large number of people running events, observing, scrutinizing the negotiations, commenting on them, informing the press about how things are going, and having dialogues among them. But of course, there's no way it's going to be a normal COP because we will still be in the pandemic globally, and we have all experienced it to varying degrees. Some of us are coming out of it, some of us in the middle of it. So it will also, without doubt, be a COP which is also very much more open to the world. Actually, that's our hope. For the high-level champions, we are responsible for curating a part of the COP called the action zone. So our intention is to make that hybrid so that we both have really intense conversations, but we're also inviting in many, many more people who will not be able to travel because of COVID or because of finance. So our hope is that this is the first of a COP which maybe starts to have a slightly smaller footprint because we don't all need to travel to Glasgow, but also has a much bigger footprint in terms of the numbers of people who get to participate in the conversations.
Great, thanks, Nigel. And thanks too for giving us a little bit more context on how we're heading into this COP and the role that you're playing. So you mentioned their intergenerational participation, and we have with us today Dominique, who is with Youth Climate Lab. And I know Dominique was actually particularly curious to ask you a question on youth participation. So Dominique, why don't you hop in?
Great. Hello. I hope you can hear me. I think you can.
Hearing you well.
Bonjour. Okay, parfait. So I'm the co-founder and the executive director of Youth Climate Lab, and we are a global organization focused on enabling youth to build the just and climate resilient futures that we deserve. And in fact, we founded Youth Climate Lab almost 4 years ago because of the frustrations we as youth faced when trying to engage in the COP process. Many of us were privileged to go, but we felt to be honest, disheartened and disillusioned by the COP. And now youth voices are often undervalued, underfunded, and tokenized. And so I just want to give a little bit of context to how we built Youth Climate Lab and what we're seeing now before asking the question. And so after we were privileged to go to COPs, we created Youth Climate Lab to design more meaningful and more collaborative ways of engaging and supporting young people. That work has brought us reaching young people in 77 countries and developing tools like the Youth Infiltration Manual, or cohort-based programs that train young people on climate policy and supports them to take action in their communities and beyond. And yeah, it's through this work that our team of young people and the youth that we work with, we're feeling a lot. We are overwhelmed, we are outraged, but we're optimistic. We're overwhelmed that we're being told that we're the future and our voices matter, but receive limited funding, resources, and opportunities to sustain our work, all the while facing rising mental health issues, youth unemployment, and climate anxiety and grief at the lack of meaningful action. Truthfully, we're outraged at the lip service paid to equity-seeking groups and the lack of a truly green recovery on the road to COP and beyond. But we're optimistic because there is incredible momentum, and this is truly a once-in-a-generation moment to shape transformative action. And we've seen the impact of meaningful engagement that is not extractive but regenerative, and that moves away from consultation towards co-creation, and that meets us where we're at. So it's within that context that I'm keen to ask, how are youth voices meaningfully and practically shaping COP26? I understand the Civil Society and Youth Advisory Council and the Youth Climate event that's taking place, but keen to hear how the youth voices that you're hearing and others from the presidency being integrated in the proceedings, and how are you supporting and funding youth to engage their peers to ensure that's not only those who have the privilege to attend or participate in these that are also being heard. Thank you.
So big questions. I mean, one thing I think you have to distinguish, I think, between the formal negotiations, where of course nobody has a role other than the nation states. So in a sense, business, youth, faith are not a part of that. Of course, they have observer status. And the broader context of shaping the politics and the mood and the sense of potential, sense of tension. So obviously it's in that latter where I exist as well, because I have no role in the formal negotiations. I'm not in the presidency. I have this mandate that was given to try and do something outside to mobilise. So a few of the things that we're doing. I mean, first of all, having young people in the team. So I am 55. So, but we have a lot of our team are young people. We have a youth fellowship program specifically to bring in young professionals. So we have 5 of them in our team. I should say that the historically the high level champions role doesn't come with any resources, so I don't have any funding to hand out. I've been entrepreneurially begging, borrowing, and stealing, probably much like you, Dominic. I think that we are trying to bring in the youth voice in ways which are more integrated. We think that young people will want to have their own events, and that's great. Just as business will want to have their own events, and investors will want to have their own events in faith. What we feel is really important is that we have respectful and diverse dialogue from stakeholders who have very different life experiences and come from very different parts of the world. And so that back to the earlier point about intersectoral and intergenerational. So a couple of things that we're doing, we already piloted this. We in last November we held what we called our Race to Zero dialogues, because that's the name of our main campaign about really trying to accelerate the race to zero, and we now have the race to resilience. And so we worked hard to make sure that those dialogues were very diverse. Some of them we had them with young people setting the agenda. So we had young professionals challenging, I would say challenging is the right word, but in a respectful way, not in a finger wagging or a lecturing way, challenging senior executives in industry. So we had young professionals who know about regenerative agriculture because they're working in it, talking to executives in food companies, or young professionals who know about zero carbon mobility, challenging senior executives. So I think we're trying to find ways of having grown-up conversations in the sense of not just polarized conversations where we can actually embrace differences of opinion. So that and then of course with my team we engage quite a lot with civil society in its full breadth. I mean, recently the UK Citizens Assembly, there's going to be a global Citizens Assembly that we had. Of course, there was the mock COP which I attended, and we had a UK youth COP process which included voices as young as 6 years old, which can sometimes be the most powerful because they're just learning just how. And I think that I'm sure it's not an accident that you use the phrase outraged and optimistic. I think that's, which of course is our dear friends Christiana and Tom and Paul who run that podcast. And I think that's kind of what we're trying to channel as the high-level champions, is the sense of outrage from so many parts of society that we are still haven't bent the curve, let alone go fast enough. But maintain optimism that actually we can together make a difference, but that is going to require a kind of whole of society move. And that's what makes me optimistic right now, is that, and I'm talking a lot to business leaders and saying this is inevitable because young people are demanding it, the technology is changing, investors are demanding it, policymakers are demanding it, and the whole world's demanding it. And so it's something that you have to deliver. So Dominic, I think that there's no easy answer and there's no magic pocket of money. I think that young people have been incredibly entrepreneurial and innovative in their activism, and that's part of the nature of being an activist, right? Is that you're always trying to find new angles to influence. So if there's anything I can do directly, feel free to reach out to me. But I think that's a sort of snapshot of how we're engaging.
Thanks, Nigel. I particularly appreciate you emphasizing that there are so many spaces outside of the UNFCCC and COP where really important conversations are happening that are shaping global momentum to tackle the climate crisis. And I think we can sometimes put a lot of weight and expectation on COP, rightly so, but it isn't the exclusive space where we can be making progress on these issues.
Right, and I think absolutely. I think it would be, and it's definitely a mistake to assume that, right? Because I mean, Paris was special, right, in that it really was about making sure we negotiated one international treaty, but so much of this now is much more local and granular. So the COP act as a forcing event because the eyes of the world are on it. But I mean, a couple of thoughts about other spaces. We partnered with Leaders Quest and TED last year on this big countdown event in October, and there were 600 TEDx countdown events all around the world. I think there'll be way more than 1,000 this year. So that's definitely a place for. Some of them are organised by young people in universities. Some of them are organised by TEDx organisers who've been doing it for a long time. Some of them will be organised by companies who have young employees. So I think that that's either putting on your own TEDx countdown event or finding your local TEDx organizer and making sure that there are youth voices in the event that they put on in the month, I think, before COP would be a good way of having some more local influence. But also the best of TEDx will actually, of course, go global, because that's one of the advantages of working with TED. So that'll be another opportunity to make sure you have a voice.
Right. I loved the TEDx events. We had quite a few happening in communities around this country. So that's a good reminder. All right. We have a few more questions that have been prepared. But just a reminder, we've been seeing a bunch of folks join over the course of our conversation. If you haven't yet had a chance to do so, please introduce yourself in the chat. It's always really wonderful for us to know who's joining us. Already seeing some questions being posed in the chat and in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please keep those rolling in. After we go through some of the questions that folks have prepared, we'll leave some time at the end of our conversation to address some of the questions that you're putting out there. So one of the other activities that you and your team are super engaged in, of course, is the Race to Zero. The Race to Zero, it mobilizes a coalition of initiatives, and so it's not just kind of one program. Represents 708 cities, 23 regions, over 2,000 businesses, and 127 of the biggest investors, including 571 higher education institutions. And all of these actors join 120 countries in the largest ever alliance committed to achieving net zero emissions by 2050 at the latest. So these actors, like, it's a huge coalition, obviously, covering like 20%, 25%, I think, of global CO2 emissions, 50% of GDP. So given this program, I know a couple of our members and allies have had some questions about it, but in particular, I think there's some curiosity coming from the labor world. So I want to invite Patrick Rondeau, who represents the Fédération Travailleurs de Québec, FTQ, to ask a question about the role of communities and workers in catalyzing ambitious climate actions globally through the Race to Zero. Patrick, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you very much, Catherine. Nigel, I think we met some months ago with my colleague Bert Dewell. So nice to see you again.
Nice to see you, Patrick.
Yeah, and thank you for the opportunity for the question and for your time today, mostly. I'm from the Quebec Federation of Labor, like Catherine said, and I'll be speaking on behalf of Tongo as well for this moment. So, Nigel, as you know, the world in which we lived after COP25 and the one in which we will be at COP26 will no longer be the same. It's already the case. It changed a lot. The pandemic has demonstrated the limits of our economic system, and above all, that it is not resilient. Also, the logistic organization of the COP itself demonstrates the extent to which we must address the issue of social inequalities head-on. Response measures will have to be addressed to respond to this situation, but also of the climate crisis. As you know, UNFCCC has set up the Forum on the Impacts of the Implementation of Response Measures, which is often, I must say, for following those works, the poor relation of the negotiation tables, unfortunately. However, more than ever, the concept of just transition is becoming an essential stake in responding to the various crises. Therefore, my questions for you, Nigel: does UK intend to put forward the Just Transition agenda at COP26 as proposed by the ILO, meaning that we want workers to be included in a more direct way in the big discussions, basically at the table? And how UK will intervene about inciting states to include just transition mechanisms in their indices? And that's a tricky one. From what I know, only Kenya has put a just transition mechanism in their indices as of now. Second one, will UK make the forum on response measure more relevant at COP26, considering the situation that we are in and that we must have strong response measures to face all the crises that are in front of us? And finally, maybe you answered that at the beginning, but once again, how does UK intend to ensure that the voice and access of civil society at COP26 will be facilitated? I thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I mean, I've just caveat my remarks with a reminder that I don't represent the UK government. I'm not part of the presidency. My mandate is to is from the multilateral system to work globally with non-state actors. So what I would say is I personally have, I mean, my background is in manufacturing. So I worked in unionized manufacturing businesses for the first 20 years of my life in various parts of the world, including Germany, which of course has a very strong structural role for labour in the governance of industry. And I've been very influenced in my work on climate change by Sharon Burrows, who I've come to know and regard as a dear friend. Of course, leads the ITUC and is probably one of the loudest and most powerful voices for the just transition globally. So I think that excuse me, I can't really comment on the you know, you're referring to some technical negotiating aspects, which is just simply not in my mandate. So I'm not up to speed on those. So I won't bullshit, because I'm not qualified to comment on those. What I will say is, though, it's really clear to me that if we don't include the just transition in our thinking and our acting, then it will be an ugly transition, socially and economically. And so this is one of the things we're really fighting for with the Race to Zero, is to make sure that we have long-term targets and short-term plans. Because, and I've said this in many a platform where I've been asked about the just transition, the most important thing we can have to give us a chance of a just transition is a clear long-term plan. We do have the time, right? We can manage a just transition if we take a 10-year approach. We can't do it if we don't do enough and then panic. And that's one of my biggest fears, is that a lack of honest conversations around the needed change. And I think this I'd be really interested in your views in Canada, in a country with such a strong reliance on the fossil fuel industry. If that transition away from a reliance on fossil fuels isn't managed in a collaborative way across a 10, 15-year time frame, then the risk is that the lack of action ends up with kind of panic measures. There's a great piece of research called the Inevitable Policy Response work, which the Principles for Responsible Investment have done, which models what's likely to happen if we don't manage a smooth transition. And it's not good for labour, it's not good for society, it's not good for economy. So I really I wholeheartedly agree that we need to make sure that we are thinking about these whole of society transitions, not just the technologies that we need. So I think that. So I'm sorry if I can't answer all of the parts of your question, but I just prefer to stick to the bits that I know about and that I have a mandate to do with.
Yeah, and appreciate your being open with us in Canada about what it is you're doing and not doing. But on the Race to Zero, so I just want to spend a minute on that, because I know there have been some questions around net zero commitments more generally, and a little bit about the Race to Zero as well, right? So net zero can be a bit ambiguous. I think a lot of us feel excited about the potential of getting to zero emissions by mid-century and are really working hard to make sure that happens. But I think there's also a fair amount of anxiety around the net part of it, and that potentially being kind of a hiding place for some of the greenhouse gas intensive industries to continue operating as business as usual. So in particular, oil and gas is a big one there, and then in turn, jurisdictions that are making those net zero commitments, seeing it as a way of continuing business as usual while also promising ambitious climate action. So can you give us a few words on how you guys are tackling that tension a little bit?
Yeah. So a couple of thoughts on that. First of all, of course, net zero is the science and it's in the Paris Agreement. So I think I've seen some really terrible articles basically throwing the whole idea of net zero away because it could be abused, right? So I think that's, so what we need to do is make sure we have robust net zero, not throw the whole idea away because we haven't got anything else, right? It is the science and it's the Paris Agreement. So I think that the way that we're dealing with this is we have an expert peer review group that's led by a professor from Oxford University that helps me and Gonzalo make sure that the initiatives which come into the race to zero adhere to some criteria which we've defined collectively with the community, which seek to address those concerns, right? And actually, we've just been through, because we're nearly a year old, we agreed that every year we'd go through a review and fine tune, because of course, a lot of this is new, right? So specifically, what we're doing is, first of all, I guess the three concerns we hear are about definitions, short-term versus long-term, and offsets, and then I'll say accountability with the fourth one. So we're very clear that we require these initiatives to cover full scopes. So none of the scope 1 and 2 only bullshit. Like, if you're an oil and gas company or a car company, it's the full scope 1, 2, and 3, right? It's not just decarbonizing your operations, it's the whole business model. Second of all, yes, the race to zero requires a commitment to a zero date, but it also requires a plan of what you're going to do in the short term. So you can't just throw it down the road 5 mayors or 5 CEOs into the future and then do nothing. And we require transparency around progress then, so a commitment to publish. Also very clear on offsets, very much guided by the work of the Science Based Targets Initiative, which has been the sort of core supporting coalition of NGOs, and Oxford University have done some work as well, that the targets must be based on the emissions reductions required by the science and then only rely on offsets to get to zero at the end, so-called residual emissions. We know in some sectors we don't know of any technology which can eliminate all emissions. We do think there's a role for offsets in addition to that to help transfer money from wealthy companies and countries to forest and other communities, and we shouldn't forget that. But we think there's no role for offsets instead of absolute emissions reductions in line with the science. And then the last thing I say is on accountability. I think transparency is really crucial. It's actually quite complicated to assess not just whether somebody's reduced their emissions in line with their targets, but whether their plan is robust enough. So we think there's more work needed to be done by NGOs like the Carbon Disclosure Project and ADEM and the World Benchmarking Alliance and others. But the main criteria is transparency, and then everyone else can decide. But we still think there's still some work to be done in terms of some of the methodologies around judging performance. So I guess I would say is we understand the concerns, we share them, and we think we've done a pretty good job of making sure that the race to zero guards against them. And what we're really trying to do, and we ask everybody on the call, is to distinguish between robust net zero and greenwash net zero, and make sure we get rid of the greenwash, we call it out, but also we applaud and acknowledge and hold accountable the robust net zero.
Yeah, got it. Thanks for that. And as you know, Canada recently announced its net zero advisory body, which, full disclosure, I sit on, and I think we're trying to grapple with some of those very questions. So that's really helpful. All right, so we do have one more prepared question, but before we go to Graham, we've seen a bunch of questions in the chat. So I think Eddie has a couple that he's going to read out for your reaction.
Yeah, Nigel, first of all, thank you so much for your answers. And we have a lot of questions. I think people are really interested in everything that you're sharing with us today. But I'm going to pack these questions into 3. And it is really linked to the who part. Who is part of the net zero? And so the first question that I see coming is on the banking sector. How, these actors that are sometimes portrayed as financing fossil fuels internationally, particularly Canadian banks, how are they participating into the race to zero? I think there are, you just said it, concerns about the credibility of these net zero commitments, but there are many banks in the race to zero. So maybe if you can help us, and if there are some Canadian examples about that, that could be I think, really useful. The other part is on municipal climate action. Can you maybe give us a bit of a perspective on the Race to Zero and cities, how they are, local communities, how they are involved in this, and you know, how do we bring it back to communities? What the Race to Zero means for communities, and then I think there is an important question about equity. And you know, in these kind of initiatives, what are the steps that you're taking to ensure that COP26 is a COP that allows for initiative to be supported by LDCs and cities? And you know, we talked about the Race to Zero, but there's also the Race to Resilience, and maybe you can give us a bit of a sense about that kind of that other stream of work, and who is behind it, and you know, how organizations like ours can support that work.
Great. Okay, so great question. So so banks, so we worked really hard in the run up to the Biden summit to pull together a few sort of embryonic initiatives and launch the Net Zero Banking Alliance that's hosted by the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative. So it's not the industry policing itself. I think that's an important principle, and that they've got a set of criteria which they're just fine tuning to make sure they meet the Race to Zero criteria. There's 43 banks joined that from 23 countries, and of course that will include banks who are on lists of banks who have continued to fund fossil fuel projects at a rate which is not in line with the Paris Agreement in the last 5 years, right? So, but what joining the Race to Zero means is that they now have to demonstrate they've got a plan of how they're going to get their balance sheet to zero, and they've got some time, you know, from joining. They have like a year before they've got to submit their plan, but then the plan will be something that they can be held publicly accountable for delivering on. And I think in the case of the banking initiative, they've got to come up with an overall target, and then they've got to come up with detailed targets for the main heavy emitting sectors. To give you a parallel, the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, that's pension funds mainly, which launched about 18 months ago at the Climate Action Summit in September 2019. They've already done some more. They have a specific coal policy, and so I think it's quite likely that the net zero asset managers and then the bankers will end up doing something specifically on some of the specific sectors. So it's worth looking at that for an idea of what might be possible. So that's the banks. Municipally, I think we now have over 700 cities. The main partners there are, of course, C40, some of the biggest cities in the world, and ICLEI, who work with thousands of local governments around the world. In fact, they've come together to create a Cities Race to Zero platform. And you should be able to find those links just by Googling Race to Zero and looking at maybe our website. You know, websites always need to be improved, but if you can't find it, then you can just get hold of me on LinkedIn or Twitter and ask. In terms of equity, I mean, you're right. I'll be honest. You know, most of my work has been on mitigation, and therefore with the business community, because I've been most focused about how to drive down the big sources of emissions. So in this role, which is a more global role and in support of the three legs of Paris, the mitigation, resilience, and finance, I think, and again, speaking very honestly, naively, initially, I thought we can have a resilient Race to Zero, and then very quickly friends who have been working on resilience were like, no, that won't work, Nigel. You'll end up with the normal trap of working on mitigation only. So that's what led to us going on a bit of a listening tour. We held a whole series of resilience dialogues with organizations working on resilience around the world, one in Latin America, one in South Asia, one in Southeast Asia, one in Africa. And that's what led to the Race to Resilience. And the idea there is that they're like brothers and sisters. So we have the Race to Zero, which is pretty focused on technology and the changes that need to be made in our economic system to bring emissions down. And the Race to Resilience is much more about lives and livelihoods. And we're focused there on the three most at-risk communities: coastal and river communities, the urban poor, the 1.6 billion people who live in slums, many of whom are living in floodplains with no power, water, sanitation, or decent roofs over their heads, and the 2 billion people who rely on smallholder farming incomes, and who are also obviously very exposed to climate risk. So that's a newer campaign. And again, it's an umbrella campaign. So we have the set of criteria, and we've now announced the first 20 initiatives who are working with those communities. And we have some great ambassadors like Sheila Patel, who runs Slum Dwellers International, or Salim Hook from Bangladesh, who's one of the leading thinkers about what needs to actually happen to make sure that action on resiliency is locally relevant. I mean, that's one of the key messages from our listening tour. I'd say two other things about resilience. We're trying to get away from a narrative which can often sound like adaptation resilience is all about helpless people asking for money. And one of the things that really struck us in our listening tour was how some of the most resourceful people in the world are the people in the most climate vulnerable situations. They had to be resourceful to survive, and they're not asking for a handout whilst they sit by helplessly. They're asking for an act of global solidarity that will involve money, but it's not only about a handout. And we're keen to try and tell a slightly more empowered story about communities which are doing amazing things and need solidarity from the global community. So that's what we're trying to do with the race to resilience.
Thanks, Nigel. Whoa, very comprehensive responses to a variety of topics. And an interesting point here for Canadians in the space. Only 5 Canadian banks have signed that UNEP principles for responsible banking that Nigel mentioned. And often the response from banks who are reluctant to sign on is because of their perceived need to finance oil and gas. So I think we're really consistently being reminded of the ways in which our current kind of addiction to fossil fuels are really limiting our imagination and our ability to engage in this transformation that's necessary. All right, so we have one more pre-prepared question from Graham Reed, who is with the Assembly of First Nations and who is likely someone you know or have heard of, as he is also the co-chair of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. Graham, come on in, and after Graham asks this question, you have a chance to respond. We'll see if there are a few more questions we can bring in from the audience. Graham.
Great. Hopefully you can hear me, Anian, and good morning, everyone. It's good to see you, Nigel. Thanks for joining our virtual circle. I'm joining from Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh lands. And I'm excited to have this conversation and to really orient the conversation on people, which I think both you and Kat articulated very eloquently in the beginning. I guess my broader point aligns with what you just shared, and the recognition that, net zero is not an outcome in itself. And the sooner that we conceptualize it as a process that leads to that just, equitable, and resilient future, we begin to deconstruct the tendency to create these like artificial binaries between, mitigation and adaptation. And, in recognizing your points about the kind of criteria associated with the race to zero and the race to resilience, I'm interested in 2 components and reflections on that. First, just how you see the principles of equity and justice being woven into all 4 of the components of the starting line, not just as kind of best practices that are articulated. And it seems like a good opportunity, just recognizing how the last year has informed our understanding of, climate justice as racial justice, as social justice, as disability justice, and those can find their way into, the principles that are being articulated as part of, the kind of bare requirements of joining the group itself. And similarly, I see an opportunity with the special working group on equity and empowerment, and hopefully that there are Indigenous representatives as part of that, as a way to frame that link more eloquently. And I think you've shared that mitigation and adaptation are inherently tied to one another, and the unfortunate reality is the slower we collectively emphasize, concrete mitigation starting now, the more likelihood that runaway, impacts will affect our ability to adapt. I guess my second question relates to that connection of being a representative of an Indigenous organization, and also tied into the Indigenous Peoples Caucus within UNFCCC. I noticed that there is a bit of an absence in terms of kind of recognizing the unique position that Indigenous peoples hold as rights holders versus the broader kind of stakeholder-based approach that we see, contained within the race. But B, also the absence of understanding that there are, equally legitimate and valid systems of knowledge that could inform how we conceptualize and frame out both mitigation and adaptation. And I'd be interested in your reflections on what that looks like, and how can that, recognizing that it seems to be an important opportunity now to kind of rethink about and reorient the kind of forward trajectory to COP26, how those principles can be incorporated. Miigwech, and really looking forward to this ongoing conversation.
Well, first of all, thank you, Graham. I've come to expect quite deep, thoughtful questions from you, and I really appreciate it. This for me is the real power of these dialogues. I mean, as you say, a couple of thoughts. Maybe these are a bit rambling and maybe not quite as forensic as you'd like, but I'm reminded of a piece of work which I found very helpful, which Amartya Sen chaired, an international commission on social progress. It's very similar in architecture to the IPCC on climate, or IPBES on biodiversity, but it's about people. And they published a very long set of reports and a short manifesto on social progress, they called it. And in that they basically said that we have to solve for three things at the same time: sustainability, equity, and freedom. And that actually they do a little thought experiment in one of the chapters in the book and say, try and imagine that you solve for two of those and not the third. So there's three little scenarios, solve for sustainability and equity, not freedom; sustainability and freedom, not equity; equity and freedom, and not sustainability. And I think they do a very convincing job of demonstrating that the center does not hold. There is no healthy society unless we solve for all three of those. And this is one of the challenges and this of an overly reductive and rationalist form of knowing. To your point about other legitimate systems of knowledge, Graham, is that it's always seeking for the one metric. So we see this in the damage which the one metric of GDP does in driving perverse outcomes. And I think we see this in the damage of the simplicity of the race to zero only. So what we're grappling with this a lot, Graham, and we're a year in, and as you know, there's been very little sort of infrastructure in place. So what we're trying to do is build the institutional and the partnership infrastructure so that we can keep building this. I don't think by any means we have the balance of global north versus global south, or of different legitimate systems of knowledge right in the work that we're doing. One of the things that when we're talking to the parties right now, and one of the things we're very keen to do is to implement a more regional architecture to support the Marrakesh Partnership. It's very global north biased because most institutions, the majority of powerful institutions are based in the global north. That's true for philanthropy and for NGOs as well, right? So what we're trying to do is shift the center of gravity. So going forward, and it's something that I'm particularly hoping to work on next year when I'll be working with an African fellow champion, is to try and establish regional hubs in the different UN regions where I think we'll have and again, I'm thinking out loud, and Graham, really appreciate your views on whether this makes sense or not. We'll have a better chance of working with those indigenous peoples and their different knowledge systems also in their contexts, because it's something that I think we're building towards that. But the race to resilience is only a couple of months old, really. So it's not going to be a it's going to grow from strength to strength. We're trying to put more emphasis on it, and we've got a small team working on it. But I think that that's something to continue to build on, and we'll be publishing our plans for the next 5 years because that's the mandate, or the next 4 years, and then a vision for the next until 2030 in the next 6 months. And as soon as we've got the draft plans published, Graham, I'd really appreciate this kind of thoughtful feedback that I know you and many others on this call will be able to give us, and to see where, if we've got some major gaps, what we can do. If we can't fix it by the COP, then we can at least build it into the plan. So what I'm hoping is to hand over a plan to future champions, so that each champion doesn't start from scratch. That's one of the risks of having quite a short period in office. And Gonzalo and I have the benefit of working together for 2 years. So we're trying to leave as a legacy a more robust plan that future-proofs somewhat the work that we're doing.
Right. Some good, challenging, important conversation happening. Thanks everyone so much for preparing your questions and coming in for this session today. And thanks, Nigel, for your excellent answers. I'm wondering, Eddie, if we have some other questions from the floor that we want to pose to Nigel before we start saying our goodbyes. We have a few minutes.
Yes. Thank you, Nigel, for your answers so far. We have a question about, citizen-led initiatives, and beyond just the structural, institutional initiative out there. What are those some citizen-led initiative that the race to zero, it could support, in particularly areas around meat consumption, for example, plastic. And I know that actually the race to zero also has a component on fashion, and so maybe it would be great to hear from you about those elements of the race to zero that we hear a bit less, and also how do you think that Canadian organizations could support? Of course, we always have this perception of the race to zero being focused on big companies, but this is also focused to small size and medium size groups and organizations. So maybe if you can share more about how the race to zero actually results in all types of climate action at all levels.
Yeah, so good question. So far we've talked about the kind of umbrella campaign, which is just about the building momentum towards zero. We've also done work on about 29 sectors. Gonzalo started this with the Marrakesh Partnership in the run-up to the Madrid COP, of defining climate action, net race to zero climate action pathways. And we've taken a very systemic approach there. And in fact, these are very long technical documents, and they're crowdsourced from all the partners, but they include actions that policymakers, businesses, investors, technology providers, and civil society need to do to get there. So what we're trying to do in that work is recognize that this takes a whole of society response, and that there are different levers for change. And it's not just about policymakers or just about big business or just about grassroots. It's about all of those in a rather unpredictable way in which they all feed back on each other. So, but any of you are interested, do get stuck into those, and we're just updating those for the second time. And those will be updated every year from now on. We absolutely do encourage all entities to join the race to zero. We do have a growing number of small and medium-sized enterprises. We've got a much simplified process for them joining that's hosted by the International Chamber of Commerce. Of course, have tens of millions of SMEs who are members. We also now have universities. We're trying to figure out a way of having a schools program. We would love thousands of schools to join. So we think a school committing to there's a great initiative in the UK called Let's Go Zero, which is helping schools get to zero by 2030. So it's amazing. that means it's a living laboratory. You know, you've got to look at your energy, your buildings, the way you get to school. You know, it has sort of kids involved in thinking much more about the food they eat and the implications of where it comes from, of growing their own food, of cooking their own food. So I think there's lots of ways of, and of course, the Marrakesh Partnership is a big open tent. So it encourages, you know, NGOs to join. Of course, CAN internationals involved. So there's ways of feeding into that through the overall network. And then of course we're in conversation with other NGOs which maybe don't have aren't about mobilizing sort of non-state actors in that movement to zero, but are more about mobilizing activists. So whether it's Fridays for the Future or Extinction Rebellion or the Global Citizens Assembly, of course we talk to organizations like that as well, and you know, invite their critique of the work that we're doing as, you know, as we are now. But I think there's certainly small and medium-sized enterprises, you know, they're the ones actually that do most of the innovation and create most of the jobs in the economy. So really important that they're involved and not just big business.
Thanks, Nigel. I'm not sure if we have any other questions. We have about 3 minutes left. It's looking like we've maybe covered all of the questions, which is excellent. And I also just want to let folks know, so Nigel, actually, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what it is that you thought you would be accomplishing through these virtual country visits, just so we can leave, you know, kind of having an understanding of how you're thinking about communities engaging on the ground and that feeding into this large international process.
Look, we all come at this work with our own life experience, right? And my life experience is being, you know, a white male born in Scotland who's worked in industry, and so and my network is based on that life experience, right? I happen to have some connections to Canada because I've got a Quebecois wife, and I spent some time in Vancouver. But those are relatively, you know, I'm not immersed in the. Okay, so just in bits of this conversations with a Canadian community, you know, I have, you know, the Indigenous people's voice is just the very fact that you introduce yourself, Catherine, on the basis of the Indigenous lands that you are sitting on now. There's a very different sensitivity around that voice in Canada. There's also a very different sensitivity around the challenges of transitioning away from oil and gas. So if I'm, you know, I'm going to go now to the next meeting. I'm speaking to leaders in Alberta, so there'll be some very different points of view put there about what the, you know, what's right and wrong and what's possible in the transition. So the really important thing for me in meetings like this and virtual visits like this is it's just making sure I'm aware of the full complexity, or not the full complexity, that's impossible, but more of the dimensions of complexity that we're all having to navigate here. Because I remain firmly of the belief that if we only solve this, I mean, the metaphor we use is the race. We say that it's actually this is a race we only win if we're all in it together. And of course you can overplay the metaphor. I understand that it's not literally a race, but it is the case that we really do need to bring everyone with us. You know, and some of the questions about the role of Indigenous peoples or of the labour movement or of young people that have been very present in this conversation, because that's the nature of your network, are really helpful for me to make sure I do the best I can to carry out the role that I've been given the responsibility to carry out.
Thanks, and it was such a pleasure to have you with us for a part of your virtual visit to Canada. And thanks so much to all the members of our network who joined us today and who not only joined us on Zoom, but who joined us on our live stream, because we did finally figure out how to make it work. So we have a bunch of folks watching on Facebook as well. So hello to all of you. Nigel, it's been such a pleasure having a conversation with you as always. Thanks so much. Good luck with your next few conversations as you continue your virtual visit. The conversation here is really alive in Canada, and I am finding that it's changing every day in ways and in faster ways than I've really noticed before in my career. So I do feel heartened by that, and I do feel that we are coming together. So yeah, let's keep it up. And hopefully I do get to see you in Glasgow.
Yes, I hope so. Catherine and everybody listening, and thank you for all your thoughtful questions, and yes, go well, and yeah, see some of you online and some of you in Glasgow, hopefully in November.
Great.
Bye-bye.
And a big thanks too to the team at the UK High Commission in Canada who helped us pull this event together. Bye, everyone. Have an excellent
Everyone.
day.